Hi everyone, hopefully you can all see me and hear me. Welcome to this advanced Sitebulb training session. I think people are still slowly joining us, so feel free to use the chat to say hi, maybe let us know how long you've been using Sitebulb for. We've got around 45 minutes in this session to go through quite a few things. So I'm just going to go ahead and get us started. Hopefully everyone will be here by the time I start my actual demo. So like I said, welcome. My name is Miruna. I'm the customer support and success specialist here at Sitebulb. So if you reach out to us through support, you will most likely hear back from me. In today's sessions, we're going to do some advanced Sitebulb training. Like I said, we're going to learn how to delve deeper into the data. So I'm going to talk you through different ways of analyzing your data. We're also going to look at some troubleshooting tips and tricks. And hand with that, we're going to talk about how to set up efficient audits. This is part of our kind of Sitebulb Masterclass training sessions. So keep an eye as we advance through the year on our product training page, because there's going to be many more of these sessions. So if there's anything in here that you feel like you'd like to go more in depth, we welcome that feedback and we can always cover it in a future session. Now, I'm going to jump straight into the tool and we're going to start our training session. Okay, so I'm using Sitebulb Cloud here, which means that I'm accessing Sitebulb through the browser, but the principles of what we're going to talk about apply to both desktop and cloud. When you first land into a completed Sitebulb audit, there is what we call the Sitebulb workflow, which is how we kind of recommend that you go through the data initially to try and find those efficient insights and priorities. The Sitebulb interface is designed to be quite intuitive and allow you to gain points of action quickly. I do go more in depth through kind of the Sitebulb workflow and the key ways in which you can find data in the interface in our Getting Started with Sitebulb training session, which you can find a recording of on the website if you would like to kind of have a refresher on these concepts. But essentially, what you have is all of your data contextualized in the form of reports, which you can find on the left-hand side of your audit overview. In each report, you have a number of key metrics that are particularly relevant to the report that you're looking at. You've also got these visual tables and graphs that allow you to kind of quickly identify what's going on with your data. And you've got your hints, which are a number of 300 checks that Sitebulb does as it crawls your website, and they allow you to identify those kind of priorities that you should be addressing. From anywhere in the tool, you can jump into your URL lists, and you've also got the option to explore your data in bulk through the URL and the link explorer. So those are kind of like the key ways in which you'll find data. They're fairly intuitive. I think most users will be able to find this on their own. Now, as you advance your usage of Sitebulb, obviously you will develop your own ways of working and kind of like your own workflows of going through this data. What I'm going to try and do in today's tutorial is just kind of talk you through some different insights that you can gain that perhaps you haven't encountered before or are, sometimes underutilized. And hopefully that will help you kind of advance your analysis within Sitebulb. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is perhaps one of my favorite hidden features. And I say hidden because I find like often even users who have been using Sitebulb for a while don't particularly look at this report loads. Let me just navigate to a different project here. I think that Zoom is messing with my view. Oops, here we go. There we go. So I want to talk to you about the HTML templates report. What this is a great way of essentially finding patterns across your site. So I've got here an e-commerce website, and I'm just going to reopen the Sitebulb audit because I feel the the zooming in my browser was kind of messing with my report views. Here we go. And this is the Sitebulb website. So I'm just going to show you, kind of jump between these reports to kind of show you how the data looks depending on different sites, etc. So as you can see here, this is an audit where we haven't done that much analysis. It's just kind of an example audit that we've run on cloud. And this is what you will see the first time you jump into your HTML report, which is all of your templates that Sitebulb has identified, just numbered. It's just a list of templates. As Sitebulb crawls, it identifies the underlying page template, and it tries to group out your pages by template. What you will see in this report is the top 100 HTML templates and how many URLs Sitebulb has identified for each of those. If we jump back to the Sitebulb report, you can see here that we have already named some of these templates, which instantly allows us to have a clearer view of this data. The way you do that is that you can look at any of these templates and click on the URL list. This will open up a view for you where you can see which URLs have been identified against this template. And I can instantly identify that these are our case study pages. So I can go ahead and rename this. I'm going to save. And you can see that that template is now saved and named. And this naming will carry out throughout all of my other reports within the tool. The other thing that you've got on this page is your hints view. So if any URL that is identified with this specific template flags up any of the hints within Sitebulb, you will see that here. So again, it's kind of like a quick way of identifying where the more problematic pages might lay. So if one of your templates has loads of critical or high hints, then you know that you might want to address some more attention to that area of the site. Now, where this all becomes really valuable is when you look at your reports. So most reports have a number of tabs at the very top, which allow you to look at the data in different ways and kind of like delve down into that report's data. And most reports also have an HTML templates tab. So here's the indexability report. And what we've got here is the indexability and canonicalization data split out by template. So I can see that from the 113 non-indexable pages that Sitebulb has found while crawling sitebulb.com, 58 of those actually belong to my author pages. So our author pages are essentially dedicated pages for every author that has written a blog for us. So I know that when it comes to our SEO strategy, we don't actually care about these pages being indexed. In fact, they are marked as non-indexable on purpose. So instantly I can identify that those non-indexable pages are non-indexable by design, and that is not an issue. Similarly, I can look at canonicalized URLs, and again, by having named my templates, I can very quickly identify that despite the fact that every URL related to this template is canonicalized, I know these are category pages. So they're essentially blog category pages, which means that, again, they should be canonicalized. This status is correct. And I can very quickly identify whether or not what's going on here is accurate. As we move down, for example, I can look at something like our hint explanation pages. These are some of the most important pages on our site. You jump into these pages from the Learn More buttons on your hints list, but you can also find them by navigating through our site and often through search. So we do want these pages to be indexed, and I can see here what the indexability status of the pages are. And similarly, I can look at the canonicalization status. So I can see that there is one of these hint pages that is canonicalized to an internal URLs, and I can click through to understand why that is and what it is canonicalized to. So again, this is a very intuitive and kind of quick way of finding patterns. And while on a site like Sitebulb, where we've got a few hundred pages, there's not that much data to work with here. When it comes to huge websites, where doing something like jumping into the URL Explorer, or even jumping into a list of all your indexable or non-indexable URLs means that you might be juggling, tens of thousands of URLs at any one time that you have to analyze. Having this kind of broken down view of what's happening depending on the type of pages that you're analyzing can be really, really useful. And it can also help you identify what you should prioritize. So if you're looking, for example, at your product pages and you can see that, half of them are non-indexable, and you know that those are your key core pages on your website, then you can quickly start asking questions as to why that is, and separate those from something like blog pages that you might care slightly less about. Now, this report is going to look different depending on where you are within Sitebulb. So for example, in terms of performance, if I look at the HTML templates tab here, you can see that I'm seeing the core web vitals breakdown. So this will be a summary of like all of the pages that have been sampled for each of these templates. And we can quickly see how performance is across these templates. So I can see that my category pages actually don't have the best performance. Similarly here for template 4, which I am not entirely sure what it is. Release notes. Okay, so that's just one page there. But by having named these templates and knowing what pages these are, I can quickly understand whether these are a priority for me. So I know that my category pages are canonicalized. They're not actually essential to our SEO strategy. So I probably wouldn't prioritize improving the performance of these pages over other more important issues that I will be able to identify through Sitebulb. So, like I said, HTML templates is kind of your high-level way of identifying patterns and finding issues across your site. Now, what I want to do is jump with you into the other end of that spectrum, which is delving deeper into the details. So, like I said earlier, you've got URL lists across your site. There's loads of ways of jumping into URL lists. Almost anywhere in Sitebulb that you have a view button, a graph, or a table, if you click through, you will essentially land on a URL list that has the data contextualized for you. So will contain the columns with information that is relevant to that hint or metric that you are looking at. From any URL list, you also have next to each of your URLs this burger menu, which essentially opens up the several options essentially for your website URLs. But what we want to look at specifically here is your URL details view. So when we jump into a URL details view, what we've got is all of the data that Sitebulb has collected for this URL in one place. And once again, that data is contextualized in a similar way to what we saw earlier for the reports on the left-hand side. So you've got your indexability, you've got your on-page data, and then you can go through and see things like the incoming and outgoing links for this page, any bookmark links, etc. You can also look at your page HTML. And the other thing that's particularly useful is the live view. So if I click on the live view, Sitebulb will essentially retrieve this page, like live, as the name says. And I can look at the response rendered HTML as well as screenshots, which is particularly important when it comes to the troubleshooting section later. The other thing that's quite interesting here is that the URL details view allow you to kind of like delve deeper and investigate different hints and metrics that you find across your audit. So for example, in this audit, I've got a hint that's telling me that there are 45 URLs in this site that are missing reciprocal hreflang tags. Now I can click View URLs and jump into the URL list. And because of how hreflang tags work, and obviously each page could contain anywhere from like a handful to dozens of hreflang tags pointing out to different pages, depending on how big the site is and how many international versions we have. It's fairly difficult to contain all of that data in here in this one URL list view. However, if I was to jump into my URL details view and jump to the international report, I can now see exactly all of the international data for this page. So I can see the validation of the hreflang and HTML-lang tags found on this page. And I can also see all of the outgoing and incoming hreflang annotations. So what I'm seeing here is that there are 10 outgoing hreflang annotations, and one of them is going to a page that's returning a 404 response. Now, when it comes to reciprocating annotations, 9 of them actually reciprocate, and one of them is missing. And we can assume, and that is in fact the case, that this New Zealand version of the page is not reciprocating because obviously the page seems to be broken. So there are many, many ways in which this URL details view comes in handy as you're kind of going through your reports. And I do recommend that you kind of remember and use that as you analyze your data. Finally, the other thing that I wanted to kind of talk to you about is the crawl path, which again is quite useful when it comes to identifying how Sitebulb has found pages on your website, and kind of identifying internal links, canonicalization, things like that. So I'm going to go to my URL Explorer. Let's go see our internal HTML URLs. I'm actually going to rearrange these by crawl depth, just because I want a page that's kind of deeper within my website structure, to show you how that crawl path looks. So here's one that's a crawl depth 7. So if we jump into the crawl depth view, you can see here that I've essentially got every single link that Sitebulb has followed from our start URL to find this page. You can also see where those links were found. So in this case, every single kind of internal link was found through an anchor on the page. In some cases, you might see this indicated as a canonical or a redirect. So that will be, visible for you here. So again, this can come in handy when it comes to kind of, analyzing where URLs are found, and that internal linking structure on your website. Right, so one more thing that I wanted to talk to you about when it comes to finding further details and further data is a number of reports that allow you to kind of look at the data in different ways depending on how you access it. So we were looking earlier at the international report. This is a prime example of what I want to show you. The international report, when you export this international data, is going to give you what is essentially extra data, or at least extra ways of looking at your international data. So this is the export from that audit that we were looking at earlier. And you can see that you've got things like this, your hreflang cluster matrix. So very quickly, I can identify that there's a number of pages here where they're not getting that reciprocal hreflang tag. And I can see that all of them are from New Zealand pages. So there's clear that there's a group of pages on that New Zealand subdomain that are erroring or are not returning the expected response. You've also got your cluster matrix, which is going to show you every single URL for all of the different local pages. You've got your host, incoming and outgoing annotation, as well as invalid annotations kind of pre-clustered for you in here. The other report that I wanted to show you quickly is the redirects report. So within Sitebulb, obviously, there's different ways of looking at and analyzing your redirects. So I can jump into my internal redirects list here. You can look at incoming links, etc. But from the redirects report, you can also export redirect chains, which is going to give you essentially this big sheet with all of the redirect chains Sitebulb has found across your site, and you're going to have every single redirect jump that Sitebulb has gone through in that chain. So yeah, just those are two examples, but just kind of keep that in mind and pay attention at the different reports and exports that you have accessible to you as you navigate through your site. Now, in order to be able to analyze the data, you need to have complete and accurate data. There's no point in doing analysis if the data you're working with is not accurate. So the next thing I want to talk to you about is different ways of ensuring that your crawl is set up correctly and efficiently, as well as troubleshooting your crawl setup when you think that Sitebulb is not returning the right data. So in terms of crawl setup, I am going to talk you through some general principles. We don't really have time to kind of go in depth into each of these here. But we will be looking, so our next training session will be looking at crawling large websites, and we'll have a bit more of an opportunity of develop the concepts I'm about to talk to you about in that webinar. That will be on the 30th of April, and I believe the link to sign up will be included in the email that you'll get with this webinar recording. So just keep an eye out for that. But in terms of general principles of what you want to make sure to pay attention to ensure that your audit is efficient and accurate, we're first going to want to make sure that we've chosen the right crawler type. The HTML crawler is going to be suitable for most websites. It's a traditional HTML extraction, and it is the fastest option. However, if your website renders some content through JavaScript, you might want to make sure to use the Chrome crawler in order to execute and render that JavaScript. Sitebulb uses an evergreen Chromium rendering engine, just like Google, and we regularly update the Chrome crawler to use the latest version, the latest stable version of Chromium. If you are unsure, we're going to go through how to check which crawler you should use using the single page analysis tool. So I'm going to talk you through that in the troubleshooting section. The next thing that's important to pay attention to is your crawl speed. So the default crawl speed of 5 instances of Chrome or threads, if you're using the HTML crawler, and 5 URLs per second, which is the default. So we've put this down to 4 on this specific audit. That will work for most websites. However, if you want to crawl faster and you know that your server can handle it, you have the option to give Sitebulb more resources, essentially, which is what increasing the number of instances of Chrome is. And you can also lift your URLs per second limit or manipulate it from here. Now, bear in mind that the maximum URLs per second limit refers specifically to HTML URLs. So you might set the limit of 5, but if you've got things like your page resources enabled, you might see Sitebulb crawling faster because it's processing your 5 HTML URLs and things like page resources on top of that. It's also not a guarantee that Sitebulb is going to reach that speed limit just because you've set it. So I could set the speed limit to 10, but it might be the case that Sitebulb just doesn't have enough resources to actually hit that limit. So that is more like a top limit that you're set. It's not guaranteed that Sitebulb is going to reach it, and you might have to do a little bit of testing with the kind of resources that you allocate to Sitebulb in order to be able to actually crawl as fast as you would like. The other thing to pay attention to is the number of resources that are available to you. So if you're crawling on desktop, this is going to be limited by your machine. On cloud, this is going to be limited by your plan, so the size of your cloud plan. If you're on a larger cloud plan, you have the option to crawl concurrently, which means that you can run more than one audit at once. And that can obviously help you crawl more efficiently and have the data available when you need it. But you do need to make sure that however many resources you have available are properly distributed across your crawls. So right now, I could set up 2 crawls with 5 instances of Chrome each, and they will be able to run concurrently. However, if I assign 7 resources to one of my crawls and 5 to the other, the second crawl will get queued because Sitebulb just won't have enough resources left to actually run them both at the same time. So it's just something to take into account if you're running on cloud. The next thing to take into account in order to make sure that you get all the data you need is your crawl sources. So by default, Sitebulb will only be using crawl website as a crawl source. But if you're dealing with a website with poor internal linking or poor architecture, you might find that Sitebulb doesn't find every single internal URLs, because what it is doing with this crawl source is essentially finding those internal links, following them in order to discover new URLs. You can add your XML sitemap to make sure that all of your key pages are being crawled, but you also have the option, if you enable your Google Analytics. So if I'm connecting to GA4 here, there we go. In your configuration, you have the option to extract and crawl URLs found in both Google Analytics and Google Search Console. And this is a great way for discovery and can highlight orphan URLs you wouldn't be able to find any other way if they are not linked internally or included in your XML sitemaps. The next step is to pay attention to your robot directives. So we're going to come to this in a second, but here is where you can select your user agent that Sitebulb will use in order to crawl. And you can also adjust the robot's politeness, so whether or not Sitebulb respects robot's directives and what it does with things like disallowed, no index, and no follow URLs. And you can even set up your own virtual robots.txt file if you want to control those allow and disallow directives in your file. Finally, just quick fire. This is something we will touch in our crawling large websites audit, but I want you to think about what data you need. So that's kind of like the key thing to start with when setting up your audit. Make sure that when selecting your reports, you only select the reports that are relevant to the analysis you're trying to do. Each extra report that you enable will add processing time to each one of your URLs. Bear in mind that you can create unlimited amount of audits and projects within Sitebulb. So there's nothing stopping you from having dedicated projects for different goals. Like performance could be a different project from analyzing the structured data on your product pages. Also, maintaining consistent audit settings within your projects can really help when it comes to that historical data tracking. So you can use things like scheduling to make sure that you have the most up-to-date data within Sitebulb, as well as the automated sheet exports to essentially build up data, historical data that you can then use to build your Looker Studio reporting. But in order for that to work accurately, you need to make sure that you're building consistent data and you're not manipulating your project settings across time in ways that might change or kind of create dips and valleys in your data that are unnatural and are affected by the settings rather than by what's actually happening on your site. Okay, I'm going to jump into troubleshooting now because that is a big part of what I want to talk to you about here. So I'm going to talk you through a few different examples using both screenshots and the actual tool view. the first thing I want to talk to you about is what happens when you set up a new project. So at the point of setting up a new project, Sitebulb carries out several checks for you before you even get to start your audit to ensure that you're actually able to crawl the website that you are trying to crawl. So I'm just going to give this a random name and show you what happens when I put through Sitebulb/documentation, which is a page on our website that we have now redirected. Sitebulb has done this pre-audit check and is telling me that this page is redirected. Now, it is essential that you use a start URL that returns a success 200 status in order to set up your crawl accurately. There's different things that can happen here. In most cases, Sitebulb will be able to identify the response code of your pages and tell you that page is not returning a 200 code. However, in some cases, you might actually be able to save and continue and see an error in the next step before you start your audit. So if you do run into those kind of issues, our recommendation is always to come back to the single page analysis. This is a really powerful tool within Sitebulb that essentially allows you to run like most of the checks that you would with an audit on just a single URL. So in this case, I can put this page through the single page analysis, and Sitebulb is telling me not only that it is redirected, it's telling me where the page is redirecting and the fact that it is doing so with an HTTP header redirect. So if you're having any doubt about your start URL, I would always recommend putting it through the single page analysis first and checking what response Sitebulb can bring back to you before going ahead with your audit. The next thing I want to show you is how to figure out what type of crawler you want to use. So if you're unsure whether or not your page uses JavaScript to render some of your content, obviously there are loads of different tools across the web that you can use, but you can also perform this check directly in Sitebulb, and it's going to allow you to also test out different settings. So that's quite a good way of addressing it. Okay, so the page has loaded now, and I can jump into my response versus render view. And essentially in this DOM tab, I can see exactly whether there's been an increase in words, links, images, any of the meta elements on the page. So if any of that has been created by JavaScript, I might think about using the Chrome crawler in order to crawl this website and making sure that I'm gathering all of the relevant information. You can also scroll through these pages and get the exact data about what links were added by JavaScript, what content on the page was added by JavaScript, and also look at the HTML and what has changed between the response and rendered versions. Awesome. The next part of troubleshooting and using single page analysis comes with these settings. So what you've got here is, well, the single page analysis by default uses the Chrome crawler and mobile as the default device to crawl the URLs that you are inputting. What you've got here is essentially the advanced Chrome crawler settings. So if we go to crawler settings and you scroll down, here are your advanced Chrome crawler settings. And you've got those in your single page analysis tool setup. So what this allows you to do is manipulate these Chrome crawler settings and very quickly run those checks without actually having to come in here, change the settings, and run a full audit or partial audit again. So it's a much, much quicker way of checking different settings. Now, where that is useful is when you run into issues and you need to troubleshoot. So I'm going to go back to my presentation and show you some examples. Okay, so I'm using actual examples of issues that have come through the support and we have had to troubleshoot and essentially adjust settings to allow users to crawl efficiently and correctly. So in this case, what we were having was an example where Sitebulb was scrolling the start URL, which was returning a status of 200, and was instantly moving onto XML sitemaps. So it wasn't finding and following any internal URLs. You can see here that we went to the URL details view for that start URL. And what we're seeing is that Sitebulb is not returning any of the on-page content that we would expect. So it's saying it hasn't found any headers, any meta description, and there's no words on the page. And it also hasn't found any outgoing internal links. So this instantly obviously raises our alarm bells and essentially tells me that it's very likely that Sitebulb hasn't actually rendered this page correctly, right? It hasn't found any content on it. The next example, which is similar, is a page where the body of the page has not loaded. So we've got the navigation and we've got the footer, but the actual body and those links in the content haven't loaded. Again, in this case, so if I go back to Sitebulb, we are essentially using this view, right? So we're going to the URL detail, we're jumping into the live view, and we're looking at the screenshots. We're asking Sitebulb, what is it that you're seeing if you request this page right now with the settings of this audit? And what we were seeing was the Sitebulb wasn't finding the content, or like something was happening in that rendering that the content wasn't coming back. In that case, for example, what we found is that the load event, so the page was, when looking in web dev tools, it was just loading and loading and loading. There were just these scripts that kept firing. So we actually had to change the consider load event to wait for interactive time in order to tell Sitebulb when to kind of look at the page as having finished loading and move on to rendering and the rest of the checks. And in doing so, we were able to get back all of the content on the website and properly render that page. The next example I have for you is a page where some content was loading, but obviously something was wrong. So we actually had the title here, like this was the brand name, but we were seeing this something went wrong message, and the page just wasn't loading correctly. This was actually an audit where Sitebulb had crawled, I believe, like 10 URLs, which was way, way lower than what the user expected to see based on the size of the website. So those URLs had returned a status of 200. It was a crawl depth of 1, but Sitebulb wasn't going any further. Obviously, when we investigated, we found that the reason Sitebulb wasn't going any further is because these pages weren't rendering correctly. Now, again, the solution for this issue was that Sitebulb was actually using third-party scripts to pull through some of the data. So it was depending on those third-party scripts. The way to solve that is to navigate to your inclusion and exclusion URLs and look at blocked scripts. So by default, Sitebulb actually blocks add and tracking scripts because they can cause the audit to bloat, and they can also send views to register views in GA4. However, there are some websites that actually depend on these third-party scripts to load certain types of content. So in this case, it was a matter of unticking the block add and tracking scripts and running that audit again, and Sitebulb was able to find all of the data correctly. So just as a quick recap, what we've looked at so far, this block add and tracking scripts, obviously this is something you have to do within your settings, but all of the other Chrome advanced crawler settings that you might want to test, so things like session isolation, if you're tracking scripts across pages as you navigate, things like cookies and service workers, consider load event, all of those things you can test directly in your single page analysis tool without having to run a new crawl each time. So it's a very efficient way of trying out different settings and seeing what works. Similarly, you can test out different user agent settings here. Now, I'm going to touch on whitelisting in just a second. But when it comes to user agents, obviously pages can't respond differently depending on the user agent. It's also a case that sometimes some websites have certain user agents whitelisted by, just like through the history of the website. So Screaming Frog, for example, the user agent is often whitelisted because obviously it's a crawler that has been around for ages and people have used it in the past. So you have the option to select that here. You've also got the option to select a custom user agent, for example. So where this comes into place is when you are whitelisting. So I'm just going to show you an example of a case where whitelisting comes into play. So this was a case where the start URL was returning a code of 200. So we weren't actually dealing, or it didn't seem like we were dealing with an authentication issue when we ran, we input our start URL and we tried to start a new project. And this is another case where the pages kept returning a 200. However, we were saying these Cloudflare messages. So these are two different cases, but both of them deal with issues with authentication. In this case, we're dealing with Cloudflare blocking us. So that could be for a number of issues. On certain websites, you've got things like, prove that you're not a robot, or age authentication if you're dealing with sites like gambling and alcohol, etc. So in these cases, what you will need to do is whitelist Sitebulb in order to be able to crawl reliably and make sure that Sitebulb can get that 200 message and get all the content it needs from the server each time. The way you whitelist Sitebulb is in two ways. You can whitelist your IP address, or you can whitelist a custom user agent. So in the case of your IP address, whether you're on desktop or on cloud, you can navigate to settings and logging, and you will find your IP address here. So this is where Sitebulb is sending requests from. If you're on cloud, this is going to be constant. This is your IP address, and you can be sure that if you whitelist that, it will be constant over time, so will not change. If you're on desktop, this IP address will be your local IP address, like your machine's IP address. So if you are on a domestic network, just bear in mind that in certain countries, domestic IP addresses do change quite regularly, in which case you will want to opt for that custom user agent. So what you want to do is set a custom user agent and use that in your crawl. So you can set that here. It'll just be a string, usually of random characters, so it can't be guessed. You can set it for your audits, and in your settings, you can also set a default user agent. So if you're you're regularly crawling the same website, which is the case for many of our kind of cloud users, you could set your custom user agent as a default and make sure that every time you set up a new crawl, that's going to be there for you and allow you to crawl reliably. Now, that's kind of our time. Obviously, we've gone through quite a few things there. If you do have any questions, what I can recommend is making use of the Help Center, which you can access through the tool. So for example, in the case of whitelisting, you can look that up here and open up our How to Whitelist Sitebulb for Crawling article directly in the tool and follow along within Sitebulb with this article open. The other thing you can do if you are not able to find your answers in the Help Center, you can always contact us directly through the tool and we'll be able to help. So that's all we've got time for. If you do have any questions that have kind of remained unanswered, or if you're struggling with any specific websites, I would first encourage you to give these troubleshooting steps a go. We'll also have a troubleshooting rendering issues article coming up onto the website this week, so it's on the go. It's just about there. And if you still have questions afterwards, please do feel free to contact us through the app or at support@sitebulb.com, and I'll be in the inbox waiting for your questions and waiting to help you. So yeah, thank you very much. Hope that helped. See you soon.